Okay. Carol.
Hi, I'm Carol Lubkowski. I'm the music librarian at Wellesley College, and I'd like to introduce our next speaker, James Bradford, who's going to be talking to us about the pressures of censorship, political polarization, and intellectual freedom in the college classroom. Bradford is regarded as one of the foremost historians of drugs in Afghanistan and South Asia. He's best known for his 2019 book, Poppies, Politics, and Power, Afghanistan and the Global History of Drugs and Diplomacy, which sheds new light on the neglected but critical element in Afghanistan's history, exploring the surge of opium production as a means to understand how global prohibition today has failed. He has appeared on NPR, English Al Jazeera, and numerous other podcasts. So let's welcome James.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. This is my first time giving a talk to librarians who I all love. And so I appreciate you having me here. I made a sort of PowerPoint. I always sort of struggle with this, whether or not that's like, do people actually want to look at a PowerPoint? But I'll do the PowerPoint just to sort of give you an idea. Maybe it'll just sort of make things clearer for you all. And I'll sort of talk about my experience in the classroom, and sort of what I've sort of seen. Hopefully everyone can sort of see that. And we're all good. Okay. Yeah, so Judy asked me to give this talk, and obviously an incredibly relevant conversation. I mean, this is maybe different from the talk by Joyce. Is while we often discuss censorship and we talk about these issues in class, I don't know if we necessarily have the same pressures that you are all facing. But there's clearly, given the fact that we have such a close relationship between what happens in the classroom and the role that the library plays in facilitating that, I think it's really sort of important. So my hope out of this is maybe to give you a little bit of insight into kind of how I go about teaching at Berklee, and teaching topics that aren't necessarily related to music, and why I do that, and sort of the struggles that this entails. So, I teach at Berklee, colleagues with Judy, and I do not teach music history. I teach political history. I teach cultural history, but primarily political history. And I teach classes about drugs and addiction and human rights, and also about crime and sort of the relationship between them. And I have found I'm sort of fortunate not to teach under the sort of lower level undergrads. I tend to teach more sort of senior level courses, which is much nicer for me, I think. But what I sort of find, and this is kind of one of the issues that I face at Berklee, is that Berklee has this really interesting curriculum where students often take 8 or 9 classes a semester, many of which are 1 or 2 credits. And they're not time-wise, they're not 1 or 2 credits. They're pretty intense courses. And students they work pretty hard. And so there's often this really sort of intense pull for them to be constantly engaged in that sort of creative process. But what I've often found is that students want the time to know what's going on in the world, and they want to be engaged, and they want to have the tools to be engaged with what's going on in the world. And I often sort of get the sense that students are sort of confused and sort of bewildered by everything that's going on. Like probably the most common quote I get from students is they just don't know where to start when it comes to topics that are relevant. So, obviously what's happened in the last few weeks in the Levant has been something that students are trying to make sense of. And so given my role as a historian, I try to impart on them maybe sort of strategies and ideas that can make them more effective learners. And that's of course a real struggle. And it's difficult to get students um, to maybe put their guitars down or their instruments down to kind of um, take a moment out of their life to pay attention. So kind of one of the ways that I've gone around this, just in terms of what I do with my classes, is I teach 3-hour block classes. I've been doing that for 8 or 9 years now, and I'm not going back. And the purpose of that is I deliberately tell students to turn off your stuff, turn off your phones, turn off your computers unless we're using them. This is sort of 3 hours to unplug and unplug from their creative impulses and to kind of focus on the world. And I sort of use every class as essentially kind of a sort of 3-hour sort of play session in the sandbox of ideas and of history. And while they do have homework, I try to vary it based off of the issues that they have timing wise. One of the issues that is I'm not sure it's generational anymore, and I'm curious what many of you think about this. Is I just find that people aren't reading. Students aren't reading, at least at Berklee. It's a real struggle to get them to read. In general, they tend to sort of prefer the sort of video format. And so for me, it's kind of trying to get them to turn off the noise a little bit and to sort of focus. And so far, so I found it to be very effective. So this is again sort of the challenge that I have. Sort of how do I educate the students who take my classes, because they do want to know. I mean, I sort of say this at the beginning that, you know, if you don't really care, you probably should take a different class. You know, I want you, if the students that I want in this class are generally the students that I want who are intrigued and have a curiosity and want to pay attention, while balancing the limitations of what they can do. And not only that, and what they're also willing to do. You know, that students are stressed. I mean, Berklee students, and I'm sure this is no different than other institutions, but Berklee students are really, really stressed all the time. And I try to sort of, again, that the part of the 3-hour class is to kind of a way to sort of focus, turn their attention away from the things that are sort of driving them on a daily basis, and to get them to focus on other things. Also, having said that, is how to do that amidst this political climate. My students often take my courses because they are frustrated, they're disillusioned, they're angry, and they're trying to make sense of the world. And what I'm often sort of confronted with are students that are educating themselves about issues in the world through these new sort of social media formats, through Twitter, through podcasts, through YouTube channels. And it's not that all of that content is bad. It certainly can be. But I think it's again, is that it's kind of an instant gratification thing. It's easy for them to digest that sort of material. It's easy for them to put on a podcast. And so for me, it's how then do I not necessarily push back or tell them that that's wrong, but how do I sort of give them the strategies, I guess, to sort of navigate this sort of space. And again, there's these really sort of intense pressures that are happening on campus that I think make it challenging for me. This is sort of something where every semester sort of really focusing on sort of deliberate and purposeful examination of certain materials and ideas that give them a better idea about the content and the themes and the topics of that particular course, and then at the same time build a foundation from which becomes sort of the basis for something in the future. So just in terms of sort of how I do this, so like as Carol said, I'm a historian of Afghanistan, just sort of like I sort of talk about drug policy and U.S. foreign policy and illicit trades and markets. Sort of my research stuff is kind of what I do when I'm not teaching. My main course is the global history of drugs, primarily focused on opium, cocaine, and cannabis. And one of the things that I sort of focus on in my class is sort of destigmatizing the topic. And I mean that in kind of a sort of full spectrum way. I think there's more students are familiar with kind of the anti-drug education that they get in high school and whatnot, sort of DARE, or the one that was started recently in my town, and then they stopped, called START, which are all terrible names for anti-drug programs. But also at the same time, it's not like a fish festival. It's not like a celebration of, smoking weed's going to cure cancer sort of stuff. Is to sort of have more as objective as possible, sort of coverage of the topic, sort of why do people use drugs? What are the consequences of people using drugs? Why are drugs so prolific globally? And this, of course, gets us into political and cultural histories, and I think people get a better sense about, not only the drug, but of, issues of race and class and globalization and those sort of important themes. And one of the things that I really sort of focus on, just because this is sort of my primary sort of research as a historian, is really sort of slowing down and carefully analyzing the material. And I'll sort of talk about that a little bit later, but this is a really sort of burgeoning field, and there's a lot of really great work which doesn't neatly fit into the political changes that are happening. Obviously, for those of you in Massachusetts or in some of the other states that have legalized recreational marijuana, there's a lot of arguments about policing and the war on drugs. And it's not that those arguments are necessarily false, but they're just way more complicated than they are presented in the sort of public space. And so we kind of attack it to appreciate the sort of complexities of that. I teach a class on human rights, and rather than do sort of like, here's all the terrible things in the world, we sort of focus on the history of these human rights issues and focusing on processes and sort of themes rather than events. I have a new class it focuses on bandits, which is kind of a history of crime through the eyes of criminals. And a lot of this is kind of sort of thinking about, I guess sort of Charles Tilly's ideas of sort of the monopolization of the state and the narratives of the state and the ways in which it defines certain groups of people, and criminalization as a process of state growth. And so we kind of take that as a jumping point to then sort of think, why do people commit crime? What is crime? How then do we understand policing and the history of police? And sort of the idea, I think, gives students a little bit better perspective of the issues that are happening today. And in terms of the broader goals, and I'll sort of move on to sort of more pertinent to this discussion, but sort of the broader goals I have is I very much believe in disruption. I do very much believe that students need to be uncomfortable in order to learn. That's not in like a bad way, but sort of like purposeful sort of disruption of what they think they know. And that's sort of a sort of deliberate thing I try to accomplish. And then the other, and I think more important thing, is to just sort of be an active reader, is to be a critical reader and consumer of information. And I think is sort of the sort of sub-curriculum my courses. It tends to be more effective, and I think sort of has the longest lasting impact. Because even for music students who have this struggle with time, whose emphasis and sort of creative impulses might push them away from books, is that there's still a way to sort of build a little and sort of plant a seed that can sprout into something a little bit bigger, that gives them some of those strategies to navigate some of the big issues. So that's just sort of where sort of I sort of come from in terms of the approaches that I go in the courses. The sort of three primary courses. I have other courses that I teach, but those kind of like the main ones that I sort of focus on. And so I was sort of thinking about this when Judy asked me about censorship. Was kind of the issue. How do I sort of approach this? And I think it was kind of interesting because the question of censorship maybe is a little bit different in the classroom, or at least in my experience, than it is from what I'm seeing on the news and some of the stuff that sort of Joyce was talking about. And these are things that faculty at Berklee and at some of the other institutions that I've taught at have struggled with, is how do we educate while also, being worried about sort of how we present this and articulate these ideas. So I sort of put the idea of the trigger warning up there. My classes tend to be, I don't really do like individual trigger warnings. I sort of put this very much at the forefront of my classes, is that human rights courses, you don't take this course if you're concerned about this material. Like this, it's a heavy course. It's not a comfortable course. We dig into very uncomfortable ideas. And my expectation is that you can engage with that. And I think some of that is that appreciation that comes from sort of the historical discipline, or the discipline of history, and sort of my training, which is, that history tends to be pretty messy and ugly, and rather than sort of hide from it, is to get them to expose them to it, but understand it. And I think that's what helps. So let me give you maybe some examples of this, about sort of ways that we sort of navigate these problems. So in the human rights course, like I said at the beginning, I when I was sort of first sort of teaching this course, I didn't want to just sort of have 14 weeks of just sort of, here's one terrible human rights issue and one terrible human rights issue and one terrible human rights issue. And what I wanted to do was to sort of, because I'm a historian, I sort of leaned in that direction, but was to kind of frame this in a way that got students to understand contemporary issues through a historical lens. So probably one of the more enlightening, although it's also really a very uncomfortable section, is we do a sort of 3-week section on nationalism and violence. And students are, I mean, Berkeley's a global student body. There's, students from all over the world. And you kind of have to be living in a hole not to realize, the ways in which various types of nationalism are sort of re-emerging in very powerful ways in the sort of contemporary political climate. And so rather than kind of like focusing on all of those things, is we kind of scrutinize the idea, and we use sort of I go into the sort of sandbox as to sort of think about nationalism and its potential as a vehicle for organization. We talk about this along the lines of sort of liberation movements, but then we also talk about it in ways in which it turns into sort of more devastating consequences, like what we have in Germany. So students start off by reading Benedict Anderson, and they read a short essay about sort of nationalism and what is it, and more importantly, sort of emphasizing the concept of the nation as like an imagined political community. And if it's an imagined political community, what is the basis for it? And sort of coming out of that, the hope is for them to kind of see nationalism as a more flexible, malleable idea that's constructed, it's created, it's propagandized. Obviously, we often, after reading Benedict Anderson, have really intense discussions about arguably the most powerful nationalist phrase that we've seen in the last 50 years, "Make America Great Again." And I think it's one of those things. What does that mean? What does that mean to some groups versus other groups? And then we use this as a way we sort of jump into Nazi Germany, and this is where it gets very uncomfortable. But I think it's important for students to see this and to understand it. So I operate under an assumption, I can't even believe I have to like say this anymore, but I operate under the assumption that like the Holocaust happened and people know that it happened, which at previous institutions, I've had to argue with students that apparently it didn't happen. But what we do is instead of like jumping into the Holocaust and sort of what unfolded there is more like, how did this happen? How did German nationalism and how did the Nazi Party construct this new idea of nationalism, which becomes increasingly dehumanizing and increasingly violent? And so we base this off a short essay of David Welch, who's one of the sort of foremost historians of propaganda in Nazi Germany. And we sort of dig into this space, and we read this article. We talk about sort of the power of propaganda when it's coupled with political violence, and also the various sort of stages of political takeover in Nazi Germany, from 28 to 37, when you kind of have the totalitarian state sort of fully established. And then we jump into Nazi propaganda archive. It's a Nazi propaganda archive out of Coolidge College, somewhere in Michigan. And it's thousands of pieces of Nazi propaganda. And so students have a worksheet. They work in groups, and they go in. That we sort of start this off with a piece by Joseph Goebbels, and sort of thinking about what's the purpose of propaganda, what makes a propaganda effective, and what are they trying to accomplish. And sort of Welsh talks about this in his articles about what they're really trying to do is get people to either buy into this new form of nationalism, Nazi National Socialist sort of nationalism, but also to deter resistance. And so this is sort of one of those looming questions we have: is this turning people into Nazis, or is this just making people less resistant to Nazi propaganda or Nazi policies? And so they get into this, and we read and we analyze these pieces, and it's a really sort of interactive period, where we focus on emotions and the way in which they tap into emotions. We focus on symbolism and imagery. We focus on simplification of inherently difficult topics. And I think students tend to come out of that, one, with a recognition of the power of information, the power of visual media, the power of the word, because they talk about speeches and books. I mean, there's a whole section on kids' books and propaganda. And again, it's really uncomfortable. And again, my point is, that's the point, right? You should be uncomfortable, and that's how we learn. We end this by having a discussion about sort of what is familiar about what we see here. And we almost always go to meme culture. And we students often talk about the ways in which memes and political memes in sort of the contemporary climate dehumanize or oversimplify or outright lie about other political parties and political groups, as a way in which to sort of push people further in one direction. And so in that sense, sort of history becomes one, they understand a better idea about sort of nationalism, also sort of the role of propaganda in Nazi Germany. But then there's also a way in which they can start to step back and sort of think about sort of the media landscape and social media and the way in which information is disseminated now. And my hope, and this is what students tend to tell me, is that they become a little bit more critical of that information, or of sharing those memes, or of what those memes are saying as a consequence of that. And so that's sort of the intent that I get out of this. One of the other things we do in the human rights class, I didn't want to show it, but I'm sure many of you might be familiar with Prager University and its videos that have kind of recast history in a certain way. I push back very much against this. The ideas of the benefits of slavery or living in a post-racial America. I mean, this is, it's really sort of, aggravating, but I think a lot of this comes back to one of the things that we sort of talk about is sort of methodologies and who is writing this and what is the purpose of this, and is the evidence or supporting what these conclusions are. I do not have as much of an issue with Berklee students as I did. I used to teach at another school, which was a business school, which tended to have more students that tended to gravitate towards that material. But we talk about race in America, but we start with slavery. We start with, post 1865. We get into 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. We talk about Jim Crow, and then we get into the civil rights movement. We dig into those ideas. We talk about the double V movement, sort of the GI sort of pushing, fighting for freedom abroad and then sort of fighting for freedom at home. We dig into Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Black Panther Party, James Baldwin. We also dig into sort of the history of the Voting Rights Act. And I think sort of the idea that I sort of come out of that is, for students to sort of have a better sense of sort of the historical issues that are unfolding here. And again, that it's not easy. It doesn't make it anti-American. It's not that's not the goal. The goal is to better understand it. I always sort of make this analogy. Like if you have a business and the business makes like terrible cupcakes, Are you going to pretend that your cupcakes are terrible and blame the customer, or are you going to fix your cupcakes and make them better and try to recognize what's wrong with your recipe? And so this is kind of the idea with this. And there are students that sort of come in with this sort of preconceived notion that what's happening here sort of pushing an agenda. And I think that's, I sort of try to, again, to sort of slow them down on this. One of the other things that sort of comes up in terms of censorship is self-censorship. This is something I sort of do at the end of the semester. I do sort of like an anonymous audit of the course and the climate. And we sort of end the semester with a discussion about what's happening in the world and the school and campus and what do they think. Obviously, in the last few years, there's been a big discussion about cancel culture and what's sort of unfolding. And there's sort of a weird space with this. I really sort of talk and promote my students to be engaged and to talk about difficult topics and to disagree, and that's okay. I focus and emphasize constructive disagreement, and I think that's a big difference because there's an intent to understand or an intent to broaden rather than an intent to provoke, and I think that there's a huge difference between those. And so some students who self-censor when I come to sort of dig a little bit is to realize maybe the intent was not necessarily to have a constructive dialogue with other students, but was, the intent was to just kind of be a troll. Other aspects, and this has become more prominent in recent years, we do have a sizable Russian student population as well as Chinese population students. So we spent a couple of weeks talking about freedom of speech in the US, and then we relate this to issues of freedom of speech in other parts of the world. Students they're going to be watching Navalny this semester. We talk about Alexander Navalny, and we get into sort of Putin politics. Is I do find that many of my international students are reluctant to openly discuss issues when other students from the same country are in those classrooms, and it's kind of terrifying in that way when students sort of are concerned about sort of openly having this dialogue about what's unfolding. I wonder if this is my sort of this out of here these are, let me just go back for a second. That I actually find to be probably one of the more concerning ones. I had a student a couple of semesters ago from a human rights course. Students make a manifesto. It's kind of a fun exercise, and it's really, I kind of get them to do a quasi sort of academic manifesto. So I sort of, the jokes like, don't be like a drunk uncle rant. I had a couple students, Russian students, who they're supposed to either deliver this in class or post it onto a discussion board. And I've had several Russian students who have refused to, and almost all of them have been sort of freedom of speech, pro-democracy manifestos. And most of them have refused to post it or present it in class because of fear of repercussion. And that, of course, is like really sort of haunting, and sort of the fear that something will happen to them when they go home. And that is really also a really great sort of jumping point to talk about censorship versus cancel culture and versus accountability, and versus freedom of speech, and some of these debates that we have in class when students from other countries are talking about the fact that they will go to jail for criticizing policies of a government versus someone who, may, have to apologize and fade from the public limelight for a couple of months for their indiscretions. And so all right, so that's kind of censorship. Now the other thing about this obviously is that they're sort of interrelated. Political polarization, this is really kind of what I'm finding to be probably the most difficult thing in the classroom, just because of again, students want to know and what's happening in the world, and it's really difficult to navigate this. The last 3 weeks have been really tough on my students, frankly, been really tough on me. I normally don't have a lot of students come to office hours, and I'd say in the last 3 weeks, I've been kind of inundated with students in office hours trying to make sense of what's happening in Israel and Palestine. And it's also challenging for me when what I know is, it's hard for me to make sense of it myself. And so, I try to sort of push them and to again, sort of slow down a little bit, and um, to have a better understanding of this, and again, through history, through knowledge and whatnot. So I'll give you an example of this one. I remember when sort of Black Lives Matter in Missouri with Michael Floyd protests broke out, really intense classroom discussions, and this of course was amplified with George Floyd and sort of the numerous other cases that have emerged about police violence, and really difficult classroom conversations about this. And students want my classes to be a place for this. Obviously, with a class on human rights or a class on crime, it's sort of difficult not to make it a space for these discussions, but also really challenging in that there's a lot of emotion tied to these discussions, to these topics, and it because of that emotion, it's very difficult for students to engage, I guess, in sort of thoughtful ways. And so one of the tactics that I've sort of built into, and I try to do this in kind of response to what's unfolding in the curriculum and my syllabi, is to, again, historicizing these tends to, I guess, sort of de-emotionalize some of the topics a bit. There's a bit of separation that makes it a little bit easier for people to access without the emotion, but then we can then sort of come back to those sort of contemporary topics with a little bit more clarity and a little bit more purpose. So I'll give you an example of this, some of the ways that I go about this. My bandits course, we focus on the Kerner Report, which emerged after the race riots of the 1960s. The Kerner Report, if any of you have read it, which 1968, is really kind of shocking in sort of the sense that, responding to sort of post-racial America, basically saying that there's essentially a caste system that exists in the country in 1968, and that we have to better understand where this violence is coming from that was sort of gripping the country in the 1960s. And it's, of course, it's very relevant. I mean, you read it, and many of the issues that were raised in 1968 don't seem like they were from 1968. That's a great sort of talking point. In my drugs course, we have a whole section where we focus on the war on drugs and on policing. Students are often exposed to Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. While in a very, very important book, there are some issues with the book. Historians, if you were to get into sort of drug history stuff, there's a lot of things that are not wrong, but incomplete. She also wrote that 15 years ago. And we dig into that. So one of the things that we'll do in my drugs course is we'll dig into the Bureau of Justice and Statistics, which is federal policing statistics on arrests and databases, and we sort of look at this and to sort of understand who's being arrested, where are they being arrested. So there's a focus on geography and obviously on demographics and race. And sort of what sort of emerges out of this is that the war on drugs is not necessarily primarily the driver of mass incarceration, which is a huge problem in the US, but is certainly very much a part of it. And probably the most important thing that seems come out of this is like poverty is kind of like the most consistent theme in all of this. Is poor Americans struggle to navigate the criminal justice system and are more likely to be caught in the criminal justice system, ensnared in the criminal justice system, and more likely to be unable to escape. And that kind of, again, it's not, we're sort of responding to these debates about Michelle Alexander, but gives us a little bit more appreciation of the sort of complexity that unfolds, and also some of the things that we don't know. And so to go back to the human rights, we talk about racial police violence, and we talk about the origins of the Black Panther Party. We listen to the Ballad of the Bullet speech, and this is a whole section on political activism, and students, again, sort of that longue durée, that historical perspective, I think gives students a little bit more understanding about the struggle that is unfolding. And so kind of to go back and sort of see this, there is kind of getting students to think like a historian, to act like a historian, is to focus on methodologies, is to focus on the authors, their perspectives, who's writing this, what are their credentials? What are the methods that they're using? What is the evidence find? What is the evidence not find? These are sort of core questions that are pretty consistent throughout the entire semester for me. But I think it's really important. And so what that comes out of that is students end up, when they read The Economist or they read The Atlantic or they read like the, National Review, is that they end up with, they know fully well what is kind of the general perspective of these publications and how they're going to interpret some of these events. And they're a little bit more critical of it. And again, sort of, this is the idea of sort of getting them to fight the instant information, and to you don't have to jump to judgment necessarily, to sort of slow down a little bit, and to think and contemplate this. And I, as I sort of show in the cartoon at the bottom, the whole issue of critical race theory and all sort of, it's absurd to me. And so I don't sort of shy away from that at all. If ever, I'm sort of in that sort of camp that I don't think most people who are fearful of critical race theory even understand it. Lastly, in terms of intellectual freedom, probably the biggest thing that I found is largely the topic itself. There's still a massive stigma around it. I've been very fortunate enough that Berklee, there's a great deal of support for what I do. I know that is not the same at other universities. I think it was my first or second job talk when I was trying to get jobs coming out of my PhD, was the question, are you going to do drugs with your students? And that was kind of indicative of the perspective of what they thought of my topic, and this idea that you can't actually have an honest intellectual conversation about this anymore. It's still highly stigmatized. And so there is a bit of inertia in that regard, and sort of pushing against the academy to embrace this. I think it's changing, but that's not always the case. And I don't have that problem at Berklee, but I've had that problem at other institutions that have not been supportive of my research because of the fear of the consequences of focusing on this topic, despite the fact that drugs are a global commodity and $300 billion a year industry, and 4 million opioid addicts in the US, and 13 million cocaine users, and 62 million people consume cannabis, in the US and Canada. All of those things, again, sort of the power of that stigma. So for me, that there is an issue of that I find still, when I, not necessarily in sort of the narrow sort of drug historian frame, because clearly that's not an issue, but going to even other areas. And I do fight that with students, is getting students to sort of embrace the topic and to appreciate the topic. And again, there's kind of this sort of two polar opposites in this. There's sort of this sort of fetishized element of it, where students are really excited about it, probably because they're doing bong hits all the time, and they're just sort of, they're really enthusiastic about it. And then the opposite is that sort of powerful stigma of, like, drugs are inherently, dangerous, which is certainly true to an extent. But what I try to sort of really encourage students is to sort of find that space in between, is to have a more honest conversation about it. And I've been very fortunate at Berklee to have that institutional support as a result of that. So I think I'm sort of running out of time. So I guess how to push back, or how to shape this, is, kind of sort of conclusion statement, I guess, is I say this in my syllabi. It's sort of the first thing that comes out of my mouth, is this is a space of open ideas. We're critical of everything. I want to disrupt students, but I want to disrupt them with purpose. So, I put a lot of planning into sort of the course curriculum and into the classes to get to that. And I think maybe sort of the deeper things is students need to take time to learn this. I talk a lot about this. One of my courses, and I usually do this, I sometimes teach in the summer, for my drugs courses, I'll have students do a journal. And this is kind of, I experiment a little bit with my syllabus, and I'll have students do a journal where they respond to the material in the class, but also what's happening in the world. And kind of the subtle way I'm going to get them is to kind of take the time to read a newspaper and to take the time to sit back and kind of analyze this issue from multiple perspectives. That kind of goes back to sort of active reading and appreciating methodologies. And so what this goes back to what I said at the beginning about when they're watching YouTube videos and podcasts, is to sort of be more mindful about who is this person that they're listening to. Is this person really credentialed? Or are they just sort of telling you something that you think you want to hear? Probably one of the most memorable events I had as a student, I was arguing with a student who was saying that all Germans were Nazis. And I was like, that's just not true. That's not true. That's, the bigger question is, why didn't people resist Nazism, and what were the pressures? And this, of course, is a massive field of historical inquiry into this. And the student was basing this off of a Jordan Peterson podcast, who was talking about all Germans were Nazis. And I was sort of like, well, who's Jordan Peterson? And what it came down to, he's sort of a conservative thinker. I think everyone kind of knows who he is, but he's a psychologist. And it was sort of like, what does this guy actually know about this topic, versus someone who, say we're reading David Welch, who's a Nazi historian. Which one of those has this sort of credentials? And sort of be critical of that and be critical of that information. And that, of course, it's a constant joke, but not a joke in my class, is to go to the library, is to go find books and to find that information. We do this in our final projects, doing bibliographies, annotated bibliographies, finding good sources, avoiding Google, and trying to find better sources for your topics, and to go a little bit deeper. One of the other things too is I try to be very honest about my interpretations of the topic based on how I see it. So I think it's kind of a way to kind of sort of deconstruct the barrier that often exists between a professor and students. I don't know everything. I don't pretend to know everything. I want students to know that my process of learning is in constant motion. I am always going through this. I'll talk about this even in my own field when it comes to drugs in Afghanistan. I know a lot about it, but I don't know everything about it, and I'm constantly trying to evolve and build upon that. And then I think, maybe to get to sort of more directly to sort of censorship stuff, and to what's sort of unfolding. And, this is maybe a conversation I don't necessarily have with my students, but probably more so with people in my family, who didn't read my book because it was un-American, because it criticized American drug policy, which was based off of the evidence. It was that the evidence told me that there was something fundamentally flawed with the policy, but that this isn't un-American, that this is, this isn't anti-anything, that this is about learning from mistakes to build a better community. And I think it's become a really powerful trope in certain spaces, that, the only one group is kind of allowed to criticize American history in America, and other groups are not. And I think that's a huge issue. So, all right. Thank you. I went very long. Sorry about that. I'm happy to take questions.
We do have one in chat from memory,
Okay.
asking if you bring librarians into your courses, and if yes, when, and what do you ask them to do? And there's also a question about archives, and talking about deciphering which institutions can be trusted.
Mm-hmm. So let me sort of get into the first one. Yes, sometimes librarians are brought in. I don't think Judy, I've had Judy in for a while though. Students know the librarians. I have sent students to the librarians. It is part of, like, when we do our research project, which is sort of like the final project, was kind of like half their grade. Students are encouraged to go to the library. Some do, or some don't. But I do a whole sort of like literally a whole class. I mean, I actually did this yesterday in my class. Is we sit down at the library website and we go over the databases and the different tools to be found, and what is the difference between a peer-reviewed journal and a magazine, and why is that important. And also, some of this is based on their topic. So, if a student has a more contemporary topic, what do they have to be mindful of in sort of finding those topics. And so I'm always sort of encouraging students to, when they do their annotated bibliographies, which is sort of a rolling, ongoing process, is when they find sources, is their sort of first stage is to, what is the source saying, but also what is it not saying? How does that relate to your topic? What is the author? And is kind of my hope is to sort of build a little bit of an independent space for them to come to their own conclusions. So I'll give you an example. I had a really, really fantastic project last year on the influence of drugs on fashion. And the students went through sort of 3 different periods, sort of hippie culture, and then heroin chic, and then sort of did sort of a thing on sort of English, rave culture, and the ways in which sort of drug use influence fashion. And so it was interesting for them that sort of building on the one sense, sort of finding sort of histories of hippies and sort of like the role of LSD in that, and then heroin chic and the issues of sort of heroin culture in the 1980s. Why do I do it instead of a collaboration with a librarian? That's a good question. I used to do it with librarians. I think after COVID, I've just done it myself, and that's nothing against Judy at all. I used to do it with the librarians. I think it's when we do sort of the library stuff, is I have all of the people at the library and their contacts. And I don't know, Judy, if anyone has ever actually shown up for you. I think maybe a couple have.
Yeah.
So but
we've had students, and we've trained you well, James.
yeah. Yeah, and I think one of the other things that I do, like particularly for the drugs course, which I think is where I'd say more so than the other courses, just the way the curriculum's designed, because I do kind of like they kind of do their own research project at the end. Is there's a lot of sort of specialized sources, like there's a lot of really cool digital history sources that have come out recently about, like, sort of, there's one called the Narcotic City, which sort of gets into the history of narcotics and urbanization, and intoxicating spaces is another one. We dig into like the UNODC and the sort of World Drug Report stuff. So there's some stuff that's just that's hyper specific to the topic, that I spend a lot of time on, just because it's like directly pertinent to what the students are going to be digging into throughout the semester. And that's not to say that I don't think Judy would have the knowledge of it, but there's just like a massive catalog of material that I try to encourage students to dig through based off of whatever they want to focus on.
Yeah,
Right. So
I'm obviously like poking the bear a little bit with that question. It seems that Judy has a teach a man to fish approach, and when it comes to this sort of thing. But I do think it's at least at my institution, it's a really amazing opportunity to connect with students, because while they may not approach me for the project that they're completing in say your class, it's an in for them to know that, like, oh, that's always there. When I'm taking a term at Berklee, when I'm heavily focused on performance and not as intellectually stimulated,
Yeah.
that's there for me. So yeah, just kind of nudging a little bit.
All right, Judy, what are you doing Monday?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's always a challenge at music schools is when you have some of the general subjects, we don't always have all of the resources that maybe say a general 4-year liberal arts college might have, America History and Life, or it might have historical databases, or more in depth about Russia or whatever.
Mm.
You know, so that was certainly the case at some of the other places I've been. And so a lot of the research level has to be, you know, like government documents, like James has pointed out, and online sources and things that are, you know, some of them are more general. But we also have a tremendous ebook collection that helps a lot with students finding information for secondary resources. The primary resources and archival resources, just as James pointed out, are going to be going to these websites of the archives that, you know, and some of those can be linked in with library guides so the student can refer to it at any time. But in terms of the primary resources, that's pretty much what happens. It's whatever is online that they can access, or you know, the professors can provide. Sometimes they provide those. We do have an archives, but it's primarily a music archive.
Yeah.
Not an archive that necessarily has, you know, collections of rare historical things or something like that. So that's one thing about music libraries is, you know, fitting your collection to do all the things that you need to do in music, which are very specific, and finding the opportunity to have collections that also fit with general liberal arts education.
And Stacy made a question, integrating library resources into your Canvas page. I would love to do that. I have no idea how to do that. I'm not very good with technology, but I would love to do that. If you want to set up a time to do that and you can show me how to do that, that would be great.
I'll chime in really quick. I'm so sorry.
Yeah,
I
no
have
worries.
to go into campus, so I'm like partially getting ready to leave. But Ernie, who's also logged in here, we've been talking. This is actually hopefully maybe if any of you have Canvas as your learning management system, they have this new feature, or maybe it's new to us, learning tools interoperability. And we're talking with our systems folks about how you actually can program in the Canvas learning management system where at point of need, like our LibGuide on researching controversial topics could pop up. Or, you know, here's the global issues and context database when we talk about this topic, so that the library resources are pre-programmed. Either it's a research guide, a particular database, or whatever it is, to pop up in your Canvas page automagically, as the SpringShare developers call it. And we're at the very like nascent stages of learning how that works, but we're looking for partners to pilot. So I might be tapping you because
yeah, no,
you're a super user.
Yeah.
Yes, you don't necessarily, it sounds like you don't necessarily need us visiting your classes because you're clearly very literate in how to use our resources. But, you know, it sounds like you'd be a prime suspect, so to speak, as someone who we could integrate these tools into your learning management page. So, yeah.
I would love to do that. So let's
do
you email me and let's set up a time to,
you're going to hear from me.
I would certainly love to do that. I mean, I am a huge advocate of just encouraging students to go to the library, and you know, I often make fun of Berklee students about this, you know, about, you know, picking up a book every once in a while is good for you. And you know, a lot of those digital databases like JSTOR have digitized books, and sort of getting students to you know, find those more granular sources. I mean, that's kind of like one of the things that with I'd say the human rights course, the sort of projects tend to be a little bit more creative, but with like the Droz course, is there's a little bit more of a sort of research focus with the class, is that I really encourage them to just to go beyond the sort of surface level and to dig into the granular stuff. So I'll give you an example of this. Students, and this is not, you know, this is what's just happening in the world right now, is that there's kind of a psychedelic renaissance, that those psychedelic chemicals are reemerging as tools for therapy, etc. And I think a lot of students who struggle with depression are trying to make sense of that. And so I have just kind of become sort of a person of which a lot of students have just tried to understand this space. And it's also challenging for me. I'm a historian, and I'm digging into science papers and other things, but I try to impart that on my students is so as I'm learning about it, this is kind of the way that you can understand it too. And it's kind of, again, to getting them to navigate this because there's huge commercial pressures with psychedelic drugs right now. A lot of students are coming into my classes saying that taking psilocybin will cure their depression. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Like, you can't just take mushrooms and go to a Dead concert and the next day your depression is gone. Is that that what you're doing is you're not really reading into what the research is saying.
Right.
It has to be coupled with therapy, because of course, well, this is what we get in my drug courses. Addiction is a symptom of something else. It's a symptom of trauma. It's a symptom of pain or whatever. And so it has to be coupled with therapy. It has to be used with purpose. And so that's I mean, it's also great for me because I get to learn about things in a way that I don't necessarily sort of jump in.
How are they hearing about it? It's sort of parallel. Sometimes I'll talk about, like, or years ago maybe, of like morning talk shows. It's like the red wine, a glass of red wine a day is going to do this for you or that. And there was even a few years ago, I think on the media, the WNYC show did an episode about how somebody pushed forward like a totally fake study that got fully published. So talking about, the hype cycle of headlines and, suiting, oh, sorry, this is going to totally turn into, I'm going to email you.
Go for it.
I got other stuff because I taught a cool information literacy course about 10 years ago.
Okay.
And there's like rhetorical fallacy type stuff that I think is also cool to dive into. So anyway, you'll hear from me. I got to go back off camera because I got to go to campus. All right.
So James, I really want to thank you for going into the issues of censorship in the classroom, as well as the pressures from, institutional pressures that may be happening to faculty on whether they can teach certain topics, how they approach those topics, and the pressures that I guess you might have in terms of self-censorship of students, whether they can speak out in class or feel comfortable dealing with difficult issues. And for musicians, it seems like some of this is so important because their music is expressing, not only personal emotion, but their responses to the world. And their music and their creativity is so often focusing on these kinds of traumas or issues that are surrounding people. And this issue of sort of self-censorship is a big one to consider, and especially how people are approaching their trauma, either whether through self-medication or other ways of approaching dealing with trauma that's happening to these young people in the world. And certainly they've been through a lot with the pandemic, and then on top of that, this growing political divisions worldwide and so on. So I appreciate you addressing that. And giving us some perspective from the faculty, what the faculty are dealing with. So as librarians, we can, then begin to approach them, especially in music libraries where there's so much creativity going on, and issues of, what scores and who is now, still allowed to kind of, be heard because of behaviors they did, or, the whole thing where people are being not allowed to participate. So thank you for that. We have like just a minute if anybody else has any other topic that they want to ask James in regard to censorship in the classroom or the intellectual freedoms that are going on in academia that he's encountering. Well, thank you, James, again, and thank you, Carol, and thank you for everybody. We're going to take a break.
Yeah, thank
now.
you, everybody.
James.
Till 1:30, where we're gonna have schmooze, and then at 2 o'clock, be sure to stay tuned for Brett Milano coming at 2 p.m., who is a journalist and music critic. I'm sure that will be very, very interesting for all of us. And see you then.
Thank you.